marvelous. Go to Daniel 8. Daniel 8, page 746, if you have my Bible. Daniel 8:9, bless you. Got it. Out of one of them came forth a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host of the stars it cast down to the ground and trampled them underfoot. So that it's a vision about the horns that are on the beast, and one of them cast the stars from heaven onto the ground. Now that has a very interesting analogy in the book of Revelation. But keep that in mind. Cast the stars from the heavens to the ground. Look at the book of Zephaniah. Zephaniah chapter 1. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Habakkuk. Zephaniah, page 789. 789. Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 4. I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I will cut off from this place the remnant of Baal and the names of the idolatrous priests, those who bow down on roofs to the hosts of heaven, those who bow down and swear to the Lord, yet swear by Milcom, those who have turned back from following the Lord, those who do not seek the Lord or inquire of him. So again, and there are several references in the Old Testament about the worship of the hosts of heaven. This is in reference to the stars, but they're also referencing the spiritual powers behind them, which would be angels. This is seen in Luke 2, where the hosts of heaven sing for glory about the birth of Jesus. Ephesians 6 talks about how we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and spiritual rulers in heavenly places. Now, let's go back to the book of Revelation, chapter 6, and again in verse 12. So that background to these angels as spiritual stars or powers. Revelation chapter 6 verse 13 says, verse 12 says, when he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. Stars falling from heaven. Now, you think, are these meteorites? Are these, what are these? And I think the key is in Revelation chapter 12, verse 4, to make this final connection. Revelation chapter 12, of course, is the famous vision of the woman and the dragon. Verse 4 describes the dragon. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. Now, jump down to verse 14. But the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle, that she may fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place to be nourished for a time, times, and a half time. Now, wait a minute, where is it? Did I miss it? Oops. I think I did. Go to verse 13. When the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who gave birth to the male child. The stars that are flung from heaven, as well as the dragon, are all angels. So the connection between what is Jesus holding in the palm of his hand? 7 angels. They're stars, but the stars are angels. I think that the connection, both Old and New Testament, is that these letters are written to the angels of the churches. Why to angels? Because they represent the spiritual powers behind the churches. Am I making sense? Anyone lost with that?
Chip, could they be the 7 archangels?
I'm inclined to say no, only because they have a special place in front of the throne of God, as Raphael said in Tobit. I think that the angel that's in charge of the church of North Hollywood is one of many that are in charge of all the churches around the world, as were these. But it leads us back to why these 7 churches. A quick answer to that would be, I believe these were the 7 churches that were the ones that John was bishop over. John the Apostle. That's why he's writing it. Remember the order of events back in Revelation 1? This is the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants, which must soon take place, making it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. So the message comes from Jesus, from God, through an angel, to John, to these 7 churches, and then eventually to everyone. That's the chain of command. Why to John, to these 7? Because I believe he was the bishop in charge of all of them.
So Chip, now, Paul established the church in Ephesus.
Yes.
And then for a while, he pastored it. Okay, and then he turned it over to Timothy.
Yes.
And so now what happens to Timothy?
Timothy passed it on to others. But he was what you would say would be the local bishop. John would be the senior bishop of this church.
Okay.
That's
So like John is the archbishop.
You might say that, yes. That would probably be the equivalent to today. And of course, Timothy would defer his authority to an apostle, obviously, just by virtue of their unique authority.
And then one other question. I read somewhere that St. Irenaeus was bishop of one of those churches.
Not one of these. He was bishop in Lyons, France. That's where he was bishop of. Yes. Okay. But he was a bishop. All right, are we ready? All right. If you look on your, so that covers the first preliminary consideration. 2 other quick things. The promises and messages hint at various times within salvation history, therefore pointing to the covenantal nature of Christ's relationship to the churches. That would be something else, which is something that we've already mentioned before. That the book is related to covenant, marriage. And so when we read the messages to the churches, we're going to hear echoes of salvation history in the past. Why? Because everything is culminating in Jesus' revelation to us now. That's and echoes the covenant relationship. Third, some, mainly Protestant scholars, see these letters to the churches as representative of ages of the churches. What do you mean? Well, for example, they look at the church of Ephesus and they say, that's the apostolic age church. It's kind of like when the church first began. You move on to Smyrna, and this is the persecuted church age from about 100 AD to about 313 AD. Then you look at the church of Pergamum. Church is coming out of the underground, out of persecution, and this represents the early Middle Ages. From around 313 to maybe about 1054. Okay? And then you look at the church of Thyatira. Now the church is getting into the deep Middle Ages. It's getting more dark. It's getting more mixed with the world. And so this would be the period of like the Crusader period from around the 11th century to around the 16th century. Mind you, this is Protestant scholars. So they view the Church of Sardis as being kind of like the deep part of the depths of the Middle Ages. So sometimes there's not an exact science on some of this, but I do know that many view the Church of Philadelphia as the time of the Reformation to around the 17th century. Because that was the time in which the church came out of the Dark Ages and saw a tremendous amount of missionary work with the Age of Discovery that occurred during that time as well. The gospel spread to the whole world. Then you get to the church of Laodicea, and they say this is really representative of the modern church age from around the 18th century forward. Okay? So that's one way of viewing what do these 7 churches represent. Now, do I think that there's any evidence for that? I don't know. Again, these are Protestant scholars, so they're biased towards looking at the Philadelphian church as the church that represents the Reformation period. From a Catholic perspective, I'd say that's one of the darker periods of our church history because the church was ripped into shreds, really, at that point. So that's not a joyful moment. You know what I'm saying? Am I making sense? So I think you need to, because you will see things on the internet like this and they go, ooh, this looks interesting. And it's like, it can beguile you in, and you have to know how to discern what is good scholarship and what is not. What is good symbology and what is not. Yes?
Can you just repeat the age that the church was ripped to pieces? You said what time?
That would be during the Reformation.
Oh, okay.
When, beginning in 1517, with the Protestant Reformation,
Oh, yeah.
and how it was split and then continued to split after that.
Yeah.
Chip, when was the Great Schism?
The Great Schism refers to when the Eastern Rite churches broke away from Rome, and it began, the traditional date began around 1054 AD, but really there were several church councils that occurred, none the least of which was the Fourth Council of Lyons in the 13th century that tried to mend the schism. But it really formally separated around the 16th century along with the Protestant Reformation. But it traditionally begins around 1054. That's when the Eastern Rite churches stopped acknowledging the authority of Rome. And there were attempts to mend that, but it seemed like it was so political that it ended up doing more harm than good, that it made an irrevocable split around the Reformation, around the 16th century. Oh, yes, and Pope John Paul II, I think, made tremendous strides for that unity, that call of unity.
St. Francis is doing it now, too.
Yeah, and subsequent popes after that, definitely, yes.
Wasn't the patriarch somehow involved in the church during Pope John Paul II?
Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, I believe John Paul II was the first pope to actively elicit a dialogue with the Patriarch of Constantinople to open the door of dialogue between the Eastern Rite and the Western churches. I believe that's correct. I mean, one could argue that Pope John the 23rd and Paul VI, with the Vatican Council and the documents that came out there, like Ecclesiastes or Orientalis, the decree on the Eastern Rite churches that tried to mend that split. You know, but as far as a formal invitation or a formal invite, it was John Paul. And I also believe that on the, I want to say, 2000th anniversary of the gospel arriving in Europe, John Paul, I believe it was John Paul, if not it was Pope Benedict, asked for pardon for all the sins that were done that caused the East and West split. I believe it was one of the two. It was one of the two. I think it was Pope John Paul II. And again, a huge move in almost 1,000 years of no interreligious dialogue. I mean, an extraordinary move. I wouldn't be a bit surprised that within our lifetime we see a formal mending between the Eastern Rite and the Western churches. I think that would be a tremendous, yes, hallelujah. The Middle East would probably be completely different if that were to happen. It's just a spiritual change that would occur.
Just an interesting thought, because this is one of the reasons I converted to Catholicism specifically, was because just looking at the Catholicism and the Eastern churches, they were split for the longest time and probably not in communication for a whole time too. But contrary to like the Protestant churches, they still remain very similar in their beliefs and practices and everything, right? So
Yes.
and even till this day, like, it's so similar.
Yes. And the Second Vatican Council acknowledges their apostolic origins, their validity of sacraments, their validity of apostolic succession, their authority that is missing in Protestant churches, which you don't get in Anglicanism, for example, because they maintain the traditions that were given to them from the time of the apostles. They just have a few doctrinal errors, and their main difference is recognizing the Church of Rome as the legitimate head of the whole church. The Eastern Rite churches view the Bishop of Rome as one among equals. That's not how we view the Pope. The Pope is the head of the church. He is not equal to the other bishops in rank or authority. He's not, because the apostles didn't get the same specific authority that Peter got. They got a similar authority, but not the same. They view their bishops as the local heads of their churches, but they don't go any further than that. So it's close. It's very close. So anyway, so those are some of the preliminary considerations. Let's go over the letters now. We might get to one church before we leave tonight. But we were ahead last week. You know, we got to make